The long ships came with the dawn. They were dragons of the sea, their carved heads snarling at the pale English sky. The mist was thick, a grey shroud that clung to the water and muffled the world in silence. It was a gift from the gods, this fog. It hid the ships, hid the warriors, hid the death they brought with them. On the lead ship Sea Serpent stood a man as formidable as the beast carved on its prow. He was Sigurd, and the mark in his eye, a serpent eating its own tail, gave him his name. He stared at the faint smudge of land, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The salt spray tasted of victory. Destiny was a song in his blood, a tune played on the strings of fate, and he was its master. Sigurd was a fearsome man, tall, broad, with a wild mane of blonde hair tied back from a face scarred by a dozen battles. But it was his eye that held men captive. The left one was ordinary, a chip of cold blue ice. The right, however, was marked. A dark circle, like an Ouroboros, was embedded in the iris, a sign the gods had touched him at birth. He was Sigurd Snake-Eye, son of Ragnar Lothbrok, and glory was his birthright. He did not crave gold or silver. He did not seek land to farm. He sought a name that would be sung by skalds long after his bones were dust. His crew, 100 hardened men, moved with a wolf's stealth, their anticipation a low hum beneath the creak of timber and the slap of waves. They were the wolves of Odin, and the sheep were waiting. The shore appeared, a dark line between the grey sea and the grey sky, a small settlement, a monastery perched on the cliff's edge. It was a place of prayer, a place of peace. It would soon be a place of slaughter. Sigurd raised a hand. The oars dipped into the water with barely a splash. The ships glided forward, silent as ghosts. They were Death's shadow, stretching across the water. The men checked their weapons. Axes were sharpened, shields were gripped tighter. The air grew tense, thick with the promise of violence. Each man knew his part. Each man knew the rhythm of the shield wall. They were a single beast, a monster of wood and steel and fury, ready to be unleashed upon this unsuspecting land. They beached the ships on a secluded strip of sand hidden by the cliffs. The damp air was filled with the scent of wet earth and salt. No alarm had been raised. The Christians slept, dreaming their soft dreams of their nailed god. They would wake to a nightmare. Sigurd was the first to leap onto the shore, his boots sinking into the wet sand. He drew his sword, Viper's Kiss, its polished steel gleaming even in the dim light. "For Odin," he roared, his voice cutting through the morning stillness. "For glory!" The cry was taken up by his men, a guttural chorus that echoed from the cliffs. It was the sound of the wolf pack's howl, the sound of doom. The raid had begun. The monastery doors were old wood. They splintered easily under the force of a dozen axes. The sound was like thunder, a profane noise in a sacred place. The Danes poured into the courtyard like a flood tide, their war cries a blasphemy against the morning prayers. Monks, clad in simple brown robes, scattered like frightened birds. Their faces were pale with terror, their mouths open in silent screams. They were men of God, men of peace, and they had no defense against the storm that had broken upon them. The Vikings were a whirlwind of violence, their axes rising and falling, their swords a blur of deadly steel. They were not here for dialogue, they were here for destruction. Glory was earned in blood and fire. Sigurd strode through the chaos, a calm center in the storm of battle. He watched his men work. They were efficient, they were brutal. They were everything a warrior should be. They tore down tapestries, smashed holy relics, and kicked over altars. The sacred was made profane. Gold and silver were gathered, but it was an afterthought. The real prize was the terror in the eyes of their enemies, the satisfying crack of bone under an axe head. One young monk, barely a man, tried to run. A warrior named Guthred caught him, laughing as he swung his axe. The life of a Christian priest was worth less than nothing. It was a sacrifice to the old gods, a bloody tribute to their power. But one man did not run. He stood before the main altar, a tall, gaunt figure with eyes that burned with a cold fire. He was the abbot, the leader of this doomed flock. He held a heavy golden cross, not as a weapon, but as a shield of faith. "Demons!" he cried, his voice ringing with conviction, not fear. "You are servants of darkness! Your false gods will abandon you to the fires of hell!" Sigurd approached him, amused by the defiance. He saw not a man of God, but a fool. A brave fool, perhaps, but a fool nonetheless. This man's God was silent. This man's God was weak. Odin, however, was here. He was in the swing of the axe and the roar of the warrior. "Your God is dead," Sigurd said, his voice low and dangerous. He pointed his sword at the crucifix. "We killed him once, and we will kill him again in the hearts of all who worship him." The priest stood his ground, his knuckles white on the cross. "He is eternal, he is salvation. You are nothing but fleeting shadows, beasts who will be forgotten." The clash was not just of steel and flesh, but of worlds. The old world of gods and glory against the new world of faith and forgiveness. In that small burning chapel, two ages of man collided, and the air crackled with the hatred between them. The Vikings laughed at the priest's words, seeing only a man clinging to a piece of metal. The raid was over as quickly as it had begun. The monastery was a ruin, its stones blackened by fire, its grounds littered with the bodies of the slain. The Vikings gathered their spoils, loading chests of gold and silver onto the longships. They laughed and boasted, their spirits high on victory and ale. They had won. They had proven their strength. The Christian God had been powerless to stop them. But Sigurd felt a strange disquiet. He looked back at the smouldering chapel where the defiant priest lay dead. The man's words, his burning certainty, lingered in the air like the smoke from the fires. It was an unwelcome chill on a day of triumph. Before he died, the priest had uttered a final curse. As Sigurd's men had dragged him from the altar, he had fixed his eyes on the Viking leader. He had not begged for his life. He had not cried out in pain. He had spoken with the terrible clarity of a prophet. "Sigurd Snake Eye!" he had bellowed, his voice filled with a chilling power. "Your serpent will turn and bite you. The glory you seek will be your poison. Your name will be remembered not in song, but as a whisper of doom. You will die alone, abandoned by your gods and your men, and your soul will find no rest in this world or the next." The words had been sharp as glass, and they had found a crack in Sigurd's hardened soul. In the years that followed, the curse seemed to slumber. Sigurd's fame grew. He led more raids, won more battles, and his name was indeed sung by the Skalds from Jutland to Iceland. He was a legend, a living embodiment of the Viking ideal. He gathered a great army and carved out a kingdom for himself in the greenlands of England. Yet the priest's words were a shadow that followed him. His victories felt hollow. The cheers of his men sounded distant. The serpent in his eye, once a mark of divine favor, now seemed to mock him in his reflection. He saw it not as a sign of destiny, but as the symbol of the priest's curse, a snake waiting to strike. Fortune is a fickle shield maiden. She had smiled on Sigurd for many years, but her smile began to fade. Alliances crumbled. Trusted warriors betrayed him for land or silver, the very things he had always scorned. A sickness took his wife. A feud with another Jarl cost him his best warriors. His kingdom, built on blood and fear, began to fracture. The whispers started. Men said the Christian God was taking his revenge. They said the curse was real. Sigurd scoffed at them. But in the long, dark nights when the fire burned low, he would feel a cold dread creep into his heart. The priest's face would appear in his dreams, his eyes burning with righteous fury. The serpent was turning. The end came not in a blaze of glory, but in a muddy field under a relentless English rain. His army was broken, scattered by a surprise attack from a rival king, a Saxon who fought with the ferocity of a convert. His men, those who were not dead or dying, had fled. He was alone, surrounded by a closing circle of Saxon shields. His own shield was splintered, his arm numb from a dozen blows. Blood ran from a gash on his forehead, mingling with the rain on his face. He was cornered, a wolf brought to bay by hounds. He looked at the grim faces of his enemies and saw no fear, only a grim determination to finish him. He thought of the priest's curse. "You will die alone, abandoned by your gods and your men." The words echoed in the drumming of the rain. The gods were silent. Odin had not sent his Valkyries. Thor had not lent his strength. He was just a man, a mortal man, bleeding in the mud. But he was Sigurd Snake-Eye. He was the son of Ragnar. He would not die on his knees. He would not beg for mercy from the followers of the nailed god. He gripped Viper's Kiss tighter, its familiar weight a small comfort in his final moments. He would meet his fate standing, with a sword in his hand and a curse on his lips. That was the Viking way. With a final desperate roar, he charged. It was not a charge for victory. It was a charge for defiance. It was a final act of contempt for the fate that had ensnared him. He swung his sword, a wild arc of steel that bit deep into a Saxon's shield. For a moment he was the great warrior again, the serpent of the sea. He was death incarnate, but the circle was too tight, the numbers too great. A spear thrust from the side, finding a gap in his mail coat. The pain was a sharp, searing fire in his gut. He staggered, his strength failing. Another spear caught him in the shoulder. He fell to one knee, his sword slipping from his grasp. He looked up at the grey, weeping sky. The world was fading, the sounds of battle becoming a distant hum. He saw the face of the Saxon king approaching, his expression a mixture of pity and triumph. Sigurd spat a mouthful of blood onto the mud. He tried to speak, to utter one last defiance, but only a choked gasp escaped his lips. The serpent had turned. The poison had done its work, yet as the final blow fell, a faint smile touched his lips. His name would be remembered. The curse had ensured it. He was Sigurd Snake-Eye, and even in death he would not be forgotten. His spirit was unyielding, a flame extinguished, but not defeated.